Hello, I'm Professor McCoy, and today I want to talk about a particular instance in Star Wars, and a particular question. Is Booster Terrik a terrorist? So, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, then you really should read the Fate of the Jedi series. If you have not, go do it now. If you'd rather not, and are okay with me spoiling some somewhat significant plot points, then listen on. It's not the end of the world, but I do still recommend the series. It's a very good one, as I've mentioned before. In any case, I want to look at a particular instance of, let's call it, unconventional military tactics within the Fate of the Jedi series, conducted by Booster Terrik. Now, Booster Terrik is an older character from the EU, originally from the X-Wing series. He is the father of Mirax Terrik, later Mirax Terrik Horn. That is, therefore, the father-in-law of Corran Horn, and ultimately the grandfather of their two children, Vaylin and Gisela. Now, in the Fate of the Jedi series, there is an ongoing plot where Jedi, young Jedi, give or take Vaylin and Gisela's age, are going mad. Now, these two are captured and brought in by, or I should say, I suppose, arrested and brought in by the Galactic Alliance under Chief of State Natasi Dalla, who has a very significant anti-Jedi agenda in any case, even before the whole Mad Jedi thing. Now, of course, she handles this poorly, and that is, of course, a topic for another video, which I might to link. If not, then it'll be up next. But the two siblings are frozen in carbonite to avoid them continuing on any kind of rampage. Now, this is, by most measures, a cruel and unusual punishment, but it goes somewhat beyond that. Because, of course, once it is eventually demonstrated that there is a cure for this madness, that the madness is alleviated, and this is, again, all this madness had to do with Abeloth, who is probably the most famous part of this series, but, again, doesn't really come into the particulars of this discussion. The main point to consider is that even though Vaylin and Gisela were frozen in carbonite, and there was presumably a cure for this madness, Dalla, that is the Chief of State, refused to release them, even after there was a cure found. The reason given is that she could not verify that they would be cured because they were in carbonite. They couldn't be scanned or monitored. No brainwaves, they're frozen, so of course they can't. And so she keeps them in a high security facility, and she does not thaw them out and release them. Okay. The real reason, of course, and everyone is aware of this, all of the characters are perfectly aware that this is what's going on, is she's essentially keeping them as hostages to ensure the compliance of the rest of the Jedi Order. This is a political act, or perhaps one might consider it an act of war. This is not simply a medical safety procedure, as it is being portrayed to the public. And so, Booster Terrik, former smuggler that he is, and somewhat of a notorious kind of guy, decides that he is going to take part in a Jedi-led action to break Vaylin and Gisela, his grandchildren, out of carbonite and out of this secure jail facility, essentially, out of this prison. Now, his part in this is quite significant, and again, I need to give some background on Booster Terrik. So, Booster, at this point, has a very old, decommissioned, but still functioning Imperial-class Star Destroyer. The big, painted red Errant Venture. Again, if you've ever seen art or a Lego set of a big red Imperial Star Destroyer, that's what this is. This is a big Star Destroyer that he got as part of spoils during the Galactic Civil War in one of the X-Wing books, that eventually he turned into a casino, a floating casino in space. But it's still a big, significant warship, even if a lot of its arms and armaments have been reduced. It still has enough to pose let's say to defend itself. Now, of course, it's also a perfectly legitimate casino. Okay, that's fine. And so, what Booster Terrik does, with the help of Lando Calrissian, is he organizes a charity celebrity sabacc tournament. The card game. Star Wars poker, if you're not familiar. I don't know why you're watching this if you don't know what sabacc is, now that I think about it. Whatever, you're still welcome. In any case, so they organize this tournament, and it's to be hosted on the Errant Venture in the orbit of Coruscant. And a lot of very important people are invited to this tournament. So there are senators, there are military leaders, there are celebrities, civilian celebrities, all sorts of people are part of this tournament. The tournament has a 50 million credit prize and a 1 million credit non-refundable buy-in. So, the Errant Venture, it's still Coruscant orbit. Its captain's children, or grandchildren, are being held in carbonite on the planet of Coruscant. There's a big red Star Destroyer in orbit. That big red Star Destroyer takes on a whole bunch of the most important people in Coruscanti politics and culture. And then, of course, Booster, being a rational grandparent, begins to open fire on various infrastructure satellites in Coruscant orbit. Now, what's the plan here? So, the plan, as it appears, is to essentially threaten the government of the Galactic Alliance to release his grandchildren. And that he will essentially start blowing up more infrastructure satellites. So he begins with weather management or weather control satellites. Specifically worth noting, the unpopulated ones. The ones without people in them, or at least the parts of them that do not have people in them. He's not killing people, he's destroying government infrastructure. On a massive scale. The plan, as presented, is that he's just going to keep blowing these things up until his grandchildren are released. Now, that probably wouldn't work. And if that were the only part of the plan, then this would not be a justified act of warfare, even if civilian casualties were zero. Because there is no reasonable hope for success. This is not the kind of demand that a government is very likely to capitulate to. Now, he has the other aspect of the plan, which is hostages. He has a casino full of the most important people in and around Coruscanti society. Now, they're all there willingly. They weren't told that they're part of a hostage situation, but they're all there willingly. So the key aspect of this is not exactly to threaten their lives, but as assurance so that the Errant Venture doesn't get blown apart by the war fleet that is in Coruscant orbit for security. And it doesn't, of course. But it does begin to be attacked half-heartedly, perhaps, by the Galactic Alliance. I believe it was the Fifth Fleet. And so eventually he does need to go into hyperspace, leave Coruscant, and stop blowing up satellites. And that would have been the end of it, if that had been the real plan. He was, of course, mostly a distraction, but a perfectly plausible distraction. Now, the only reason that the distraction element is relevant for the question of was this terrorism and was this justified is that the distraction and the actual operation that was going on the ground to release Phelan and Gisela, that is what allows this plan a chance for success. And again, as I've talked about before, just war theory requires a chance of success for something to be justified. And plain old ethics requires that there be some reasonable connection between the action and the end of the action. If there is no connection between the action and the end of your action, doing so becomes incoherent, irrational, and therefore unethical. If, for example, I decide to disturb Angel, who is laying on my lap, I don't know if she's out of frame, but you saw her earlier. She's almost asleep. I could wake her up, because I really think that it would be great if she could give her contributions to this topic. Because I think maybe, you know what, I bet she has something interesting to say about this topic. Now, me waking up the poor cat, who does not want to wake up, would not be justified in that case. Because, no, she's not going to contribute anything to this topic of discussion. She might, at most, meow at me in complaint. And that's not really going to help you understand the situation any better. But if, instead, I simply want her to make an appearance on camera and be cute, that might succeed. And so there might be a justification there. So, bringing this back to Booster Terrik, there might actually be a chance at rescuing his grandchildren if him blowing up satellites and taking hostages isn't the only part of the plan. If there's more going on, in fact, there was more going on, and in fact, the plan does succeed. So, there you go. Excellent. Excellent as far as it goes, but we have more to examine. Because we now have to look to whether he was justified in taking hostages, holding them, and, of course, destroying government property. So first of all, taking hostages. The hostages entered the errant venture and entered the tournament voluntarily. They even stayed voluntarily. There was a point at which, this was of course during the attack, that Terrik and Lando Calrissian, the host of the tournament, gave everyone the opportunity to leave and forfeit their 1,000,000 credit entry fee. Almost no one did. All of the hostages remained in their precarious hostage situation because they had already entered a high-stakes sabacc tournament. They weren't about to leave now. This was already planned to be a 3-day-long tournament, conveniently enough, and so they agreed to stay and to be hostages, so to speak. Now, of course, they weren't, being treated as hostages. They weren't under any direct threat or anything. And in fact, as I said, they were even permitted to leave if they wanted to, but they would have forfeited their significant entry fee, which almost no one was willing to do. And enough were unwilling to do that they were, of course, willing to. There were enough there so that there would remain enough hostages to prevent the Galactic Alliance fleets from simply destroying the errant venture. Okay, so hostages, setting that aside. They were there voluntarily. Yes, they were being used as something like human shields in a sense, but they were there perfectly voluntarily. And so, the justice or injustice of the situation has to look to the other aspect of it, of destroying government property. Well, of course, first of all, we have to look to whether this is a just cause or not. That's one aspect. And the freeing of one's grandchildren who are being held hostage unjustly and against the prior agreements of a government, well, I would say is certainly a justified end, is a good end to pursue. Now, it's, again, as the saying goes, a good end does not justify any means. So we still have to look to the means and to see if it's justified, but I do think that freeing those who are unjustly imprisoned, particularly when one has particular obligations to them, as familial obligations, if they're your grandchildren, again, I do think that that sort of end is one which is just to pursue. Okay, so what about the means of pursuing that by destroying government property? Okay, there's two ways you can approach this. First is the radical way, and the other is the moderate way. The radical approach is more or less the Rothbardian approach. So if we take this as someone like Murray Rothbard or like Hans Hermann Hoppe would approach it, we have to look at what is the nature of government property. Rothbard and Hoppe would argue that government property is either unowned, or ought to be considered unowned, because it is essentially stolen property. And because it is stolen, it should be in and of itself considered to be unowned, and so can be justly homesteaded or made use of by any member of the public. Now, this is a very radical position. They have defenses for this position, but I don't want to really go into it too much here. Just know that that is one potential answer to this question, is that, well, government property is unowned, so blowing it up is, well, not a crime against anyone in particular. So it's perfectly permissible if you have a good reason for it. Okay, again, that's a very radical position, and I'm not even committing to it necessarily here, but I do think there are solid arguments for it, which I'll link to if I can find them, ideally in YouTube video format. A more moderate version of this position, which is still sort of the Rothbardian type of position, is that government property is not unowned, but it is owned by the taxpayers. It is owned by the people who are represented by the government which owns it. If that is the case, then we have to determine what is owned by whom, because collective ownership gets murky, especially if you're going to do something like blow it up. And so you have to. And so the best way of looking at this is by looking at net tax payment, right? So so to determine what elements or what aspects or how much of public property, state property essentially, belongs to any given taxpayer, you have to look at what their net tax bill is. Are they a net taxpayer? Or are they a net receiver? Well, Booster Terrik, who, yes, to be fair, was at some point a criminal who, quote, paid his debt to society in the spice mines of Kessel, did eventually wind up paying a great deal in taxes over the years. He has had this, the errant venture as a floating casino that he has been paying taxes on to the New Republic and its successor state, the Galactic Alliance, for around 30 years at this point. Perhaps even more, actually. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at the days. And so he has certainly paid his fair share of taxes. And I would assume, of course we don't have the numbers for this, so we're working on an assumption here, has very likely, though, paid more in taxes to the GA, and presumably to the prior state, to the New Republic, than the value of the infrastructure satellites that he destroyed in this attack. So even after destroying these satellites, he is still, we would say, a net taxpayer. And so what he has done is, effectively, is destroyed that element of public property which would rightfully belong to him anyway in the first place. Okay, so maybe we don't want to go that far. That's still a bit radical. That is still a rather libertarian position, rather than a sort of a more conventional or more statist position. Okay. Let's assume that government property is in fact property of the organization of the government. It is in no way the property of the citizenry or of the public. And so this is not his property that he is destroying. Well, in that case, we have to ask, is this an act of terrorism? And is this unjustified? The first question is more complicated than the second, oddly. Because the second question comes down now to an act of just warfare. He is attacking an organization which has committed a grave injustice against his grandchildren in particular, but a grave injustice in general. And he is attempting to rectify that injustice in a way which caused no direct harm to innocent people. And he's not destroying inhabited satellites here. This is inhabited orbital facilities here. That's an important note. He's destroying infrastructure, which, while it does have its negative effects, is limiting civilian casualties to the greatest extent possible, which is, again, one of the very important requirements of just war. So even assuming that this government property, this property of the Galactic Alliance, is in no way owned or owed to Booster Terrik, him destroying it is an act of war, or analogous at least to an act of war, against an unjust aggressor in an attempt to rectify the injustice that has been committed in a way that follows the structures of just war. Okay. One more concern. Is it terrorism? So, terrorism involves a few key aspects. Terrorism is typically defined, or at least one common way of defining it, is indiscriminate violence against civilian targets for the purpose of engendering fear to lead to political change. So the fear of indiscriminate violence against civilian targets is what leads to particular political change. Now, if you take this act of blowing up satellites simply at the surface level, and you completely forget anything having to do with any diversion tactics or any help on the ground or anything else. If you just assume that the tactic is, I'm going to blow up satellites until Natasi Dala lets my grandchildren free, you can make an argument that that is terrorism. Now, you might be able to make an argument that it's still justified. because the indiscriminate violence is still following the other principles of just war. It is not targeting civilians, it is limiting collateral damage, it's limiting casualties, it is a last resort, etc. Right? Maybe it is doing all of this. Now, again, we might have the question of whether there's a real chance of success. That's questionable. But keeping in mind that this, in fact, was a simple distraction tactic, this was part of a larger operation, and that larger operation had a real chance of success, and in fact succeeded, it loses the element of indiscriminate damage for the sake of causing fear, which is what would define it as an act of terrorism. So, to answer the initial question, is Booster Terrik a terrorist? I mean, maybe, but due to past actions, not because of this. This, in fact, I argue, would not be considered an act of terrorism, because it was only part of a larger operation, and that larger operation succeeded by other means. It was not done by political change implemented through fear. And I would go further as to say that even if it can be defined as an act of terrorism, it might still be justifiable under just war provisions. And so this becomes a little bit fascinating, because this may imply that there are instances of terrorism which can be justified by just war. Again, so long as it barely fits some definitions of terrorism. Most instances of terrorism, if they're ordinary cases where civilians are targeted, which is typically what we mean in non-strange cases like this, something like that is, by default, it simply cannot be justified. But something like this may be a bizarre exception. And I, as a philosopher, I love bizarre exceptions to general rules, because I think that is what makes them look worth looking at. That's what makes them fascinating. That's what makes them interesting. And that's part of why I love the Star Wars Expanded Universe, because it's full of quirky little plans and plots and schemes and things like this. Absolutely worth diving into if you haven't. So, there's my sales pitch. There's my analysis. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed the Star Wars Expanded Universe as much as I do. And I hope to see you in the next video.